Welcome to the channel where American history becomes simple, clear, and meaningful. Here, we don't just study dates and events, we learn English through real stories that shaped the United States. In today's episode, we explore first colonials and their stories. As we move through this story, we'll discover how ordinary people, over time, slowly began to see themselves in a new way, but as Americans. So listen carefully, learn naturally, and travel back in time with us. Let's begin.
Colonial Indian relations. When Europeans arrived in North America, they did not enter an empty land. Millions of Native Americans already lived there, with their own cultures, traditions, and deep connections to the land. At first, relations between Native Americans and European settlers were often peaceful and cooperative. The newcomers depended on native knowledge to survive. Native tribes taught them how to grow corn, hunt local animals, and travel through forests and rivers. In return, Europeans traded metal tools, weapons, and cloth. But this fragile cooperation did not last. As more settlers arrived, they demanded more land. Europeans believed land should be owned, fenced, and farmed. Native Americans, however, saw land as shared and sacred. This difference in thinking created serious misunderstandings and conflict. Disease caused even greater destruction. Europeans unknowingly brought smallpox, measles, and influenza. Native Americans had no immunity to these illnesses. Entire villages disappeared, sometimes before settlers ever met the people who lived there. Violence slowly replaced cooperation. In Virginia, rising tensions led to repeated attacks on both sides. In 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy launched a major surprise attack on English settlements, killing hundreds of colonists. The English responded with brutal retaliation, burning villages and destroying crops. In New England, relations followed a similar path. Early peace agreements collapsed as Puritan settlements expanded. In 1675, a devastating conflict known as King Philip's War broke out. It became one of the bloodiest wars in colonial history. By the end, many native communities were destroyed, and English control of the region was firmly established. Some colonies tried a different approach. In Pennsylvania, William Penn promoted fair treatment and honest trade with native tribes. For several decades, this policy brought relative peace. But after Penn's death, settlers ignored his agreements and pushed westward. By the late 1600s, Native Americans had lost vast amounts of land. Some were forced into treaties they did not fully understand. Others were pushed west or killed by war, hunger, and disease. Colonial Indian relations shaped the future of America. They were marked by cooperation, misunderstanding, violence, and loss, and their consequences are still felt today. Second generation of British colonies. In the middle of the 17th century, England was in chaos. Civil war, political struggles, and religious conflict pulled the country's attention away from its colonies in North America. Fewer people migrated, and the English government largely ignored the small settlements across the Atlantic. Because England offered little protection, the colonies had to defend themselves. In 1643, 4 New England colonies, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven, joined together to form the New England Confederation. This was the first serious attempt by European settlers in America to work together as a region. Life in the colonies, however, was far from peaceful. Religious and political arguments divided settlers just as deeply as they had divided England. In Maryland, tensions between Catholics and Protestants became especially intense. During the rule of Oliver Cromwell, religious tolerance collapsed, and Maryland's Toleration Act was cancelled. Although it was later restored, the episode showed how fragile religious freedom really was. Everything changed again in 1660, when King Charles II returned to the English throne. England renewed its interest in North America and moved quickly to expand its control. Within a short time, new colonies were founded in the Carolinas, and England turned its attention to a powerful rival, the Dutch. The Dutch colony of New Netherland, centered on modern-day New York, was ruled by governors appointed from Europe. These governors were strict and unpopular. When English settlers began pushing into Dutch territory, the local population refused to defend their leaders. In 1664, New Netherland fell to the English without much resistance. The English takeover was surprisingly gentle. Dutch settlers were allowed to keep their land, practice their religion, and continue their way of life. Meanwhile, the southern colonies were taking shape. In the Albemarle Sound of present-day North Carolina, settlers slowly arrived from Virginia. The area remained remote for decades. Its first real town was founded only in 1704, when French Protestants finally settled there. Farther south, in 1670, settlers from New England and the Caribbean founded Charleston, South Carolina. The colony experimented with a complex system of government, influenced by the philosopher John Locke. One bold idea, a hereditary nobility, failed completely. Early South Carolina also relied on the harsh trade of Indian slaves, though its economy later shifted to rice, indigo, and timber. In 1681, another colony was born with a very different vision. William Penn, a Quaker and close friend of the king, received land that became Pennsylvania. Penn dreamed of a society based on religious freedom, equality, and fairness. He welcomed persecuted groups from across Europe and founded Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Pennsylvania stood out. Women enjoyed more rights than in other colonies, and Native Americans were paid for their land, not simply pushed aside. For a time, Penn's colony offered a rare example of peaceful coexistence. The last British colony, Georgia, was founded in 1732. Located near Spanish Florida, it served as a military buffer. But Georgia had another purpose. Its founder, James Oglethorpe, wanted it to be a fresh start for the poor and for former prisoners, a place where people could rebuild their lives. By the early 18th century, Britain had established 13 colonies, each with its own character. Together, they formed a diverse and restless society, one that would soon begin to question British rule itself.
Settlers, slaves, and servants. For many people in Europe, life in the 17th century was hard and uncertain. Land was scarce, jobs were few, and prisons were full. When stories began to spread about a new life across the Atlantic, America sounded like a land of second chances. But getting there was not easy. Very few people could afford the long and dangerous journey to the New World. Ships were expensive, and food, tools, and land all cost money. To solve this problem, a system developed that would shape colonial society for generations. It was called indentured servitude. Under this system, poor men and women agreed to work for a master in America for 4 to 7 years. In exchange, their travel costs were paid. Some were persuaded by hopeful promises. Others were pressured by courts or prison officials and offered a choice: serve time in jail or sail to the colonies. Ship captains often earned money by selling these labor contracts. They packed ships tightly and used every method possible, from bold advertising to outright kidnapping, to fill their vessels. When indentured servants arrived in America, their lives were difficult. They worked long hours on farms, plantations, or in workshops. Some ran away. Many did not survive disease or harsh conditions. But those who completed their service were rewarded with freedom dues, clothes, tools, and sometimes a small piece of land. For many, this system worked. By the late 1600s, nearly half of all settlers south of New England had arrived as indentured servants. After gaining their freedom, many became farmers, craftsmen, and even political leaders. There was no social shame in having once been a servant. Colonial society allowed people to rise. But there was one group for whom America offered no freedom at all. In 1619, the first Africans were brought to Virginia. At first, some were treated like indentured servants and later gained their freedom. But as plantation farming expanded and the demand for labor grew, attitudes hardened. By the 1660s, the colonies began to create laws that turned Africans into property. Unlike indentured servants, African slaves were forced to work for life. They could not earn freedom. Their children were born into slavery. They were brought across the ocean in chains and sold in markets, stripped of rights and dignity. This system of slavery became central to the economy of the southern colonies, especially on tobacco, rice, and later cotton plantations. While some colonists gained wealth and comfort, enslaved Africans paid the price with their freedom and often their lives. By the early 18th century, America was a land of sharp contrasts. It was a place of opportunity for some, hardship for many, and suffering for others. The labor systems that built the colonies also planted deep divisions that would shape American history for centuries to come.
America was built by many hands, free, unfree, and forgotten. Their stories still matter today. If history helps us understand the present, then remembering these people is a responsibility. If you found this story useful, like the video, subscribe, and continue learning history through stories.